Part 1. The universal void. Have you ever felt like something fundamental is missing from your life? Like you're going through the motions, but there's an emptiness that no amount of success, relationships, or distractions can fill. You're not alone. This feeling has haunted humanity for centuries, and no one understood it better than Fyodor Dostoevsky. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. You're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and despite having everything you thought you wanted, maybe a good job, people who care about you, enough money to pay your bills, there's this gnawing sensation in your chest, a void, an ache that whispers, "Is this it? Is this all there is?" You might scroll through your phone, hoping for something to fill the silence. You might replay conversations from the day, searching for meaning in the mundane. You might even feel guilty for feeling empty when you have so much to be grateful for. But the emptiness doesn't care about your gratitude list. It doesn't care about your achievements or your Instagram feed. It sits there, patient and persistent, like a question you can't quite formulate. This isn't depression, though it might masquerade as it. This isn't anxiety, though it creates its own form of restlessness. This is something deeper, more fundamental. It's the human condition stripped bare, the recognition that beneath all our busyness and distraction lies a profound question. What's the point? You're experiencing what philosophers call existential emptiness, the confrontation with the apparent meaninglessness of existence. And while this might sound abstract or academic, I promise you it's not. It's as real as your heartbeat, as immediate as your next breath. It's the feeling that brought you here, to this moment, searching for answers. The beautiful and terrible truth is that you're part of an ancient conversation. Every human being who has ever lived has faced this void in some form. The cave painter who stopped mid-brushstroke and wondered why he was painting. The Egyptian pharaoh who built pyramids to escape the inevitable. The medieval peasant who looked up at the stars and felt overwhelmingly small. The modern CEO who reaches the top of the corporate ladder only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. We are all members of what we might call the 3 a.m. club, those who have stared into the abyss of their own existence and felt it stare back. But here's where it gets interesting. Most of us try to run from this feeling. We busy ourselves with work, relationships, entertainment, goals, causes, anything to avoid sitting with a fundamental question of our existence. We live in an age of unprecedented distraction. We have more ways to avoid ourselves than any generation in history. Netflix queues that never end, social media feeds that scroll infinitely, news cycles that never pause, shopping that never satisfies, dating apps that promise connection but deliver consumption. We can literally go months without a single moment of genuine solitude, without ever having to confront the silence within ourselves. But the emptiness is patient. It waits. It finds you in the gaps between notifications, in the silence after the music stops, in the moment before sleep when all your defenses are down. It's there because it's trying to tell you something important. This is where Fyodor Dostoevsky enters our story. Born in Moscow in 1821, Dostoevsky lived through some of the most turbulent times in Russian history. He experienced poverty, imprisonment, and exile. He faced a mock execution that was called off at the last moment. Imagine the psychological impact of literally facing death and then being granted life. He struggled with gambling addiction, epilepsy, and the loss of his first wife and infant son. He knew suffering intimately. But more importantly, he understood something profound about the human soul. Dostoevsky didn't just write novels. He conducted psychological experiments on the human condition. His characters aren't just literary creations. They're case studies in what happens when human beings confront the fundamental questions of existence. They're mirrors in which we can see our own struggles with meaning, purpose, and the terrible freedom of being human. What makes Dostoevsky our perfect guide to the darkness of existential emptiness is that he didn't offer easy answers. He didn't write self-help books or provide simple solutions to complex problems. Instead, he took us deep into the psychology of characters who embody different responses to the void. He showed us what happens when we try to fill emptiness with power, with intellect, with rebellion, with submission, with love, with faith. His characters are us pushed to extremes. They're what we might become if we followed our current paths to their logical conclusions. The underground man, isolated and spiteful, represents what happens when we retreat from life entirely. Raskolnikov shows us the emptiness that comes from trying to transcend moral boundaries. Ivan Karamazov demonstrates how pure intellect can become a prison. The Grand Inquisitor reveals how we trade freedom for false security. But Dostoevsky also gave us characters who found their way through the darkness. Alyosha, Sonia, Prince Mishkin. People who discovered something profound about how to live authentically in a world that often seems meaningless. Here's what Dostoevsky understood that we often miss. The emptiness you feel is a mistake. It's not a malfunction or a character flaw. It's not something to be medicated away or distracted from or solved with a weekend workshop. The emptiness is information. It's your soul's way of telling you that something is wrong with how you're living, but not in the way you think. Most of us assume that feeling empty means we need to fill ourselves up with something. More success, more love, more experiences, more stuff. We think emptiness is the absence of something good. So we go hunting for that missing piece. But what if that's exactly backwards? What if the emptiness isn't telling you what's missing, but what's false? What if it's not pointing to an absence, but to a presence? The present of a life that isn't truly yours. Think about it this way. If you were living completely authentically, making choices that align with your deepest values, taking full responsibility for your life, engaging in relationships based on genuine care rather than need, pursuing work that mattered to you, would you feel empty or would you feel challenged, sometimes overwhelmed, occasionally scared, but fundamentally engaged with existence? The emptiness might not be pointing to what you lack, but to how much of your life is spent in patterns that aren't truly chosen, in relationships that aren't authentic, in work that doesn't matter to you, in pursuits that someone else convinced you were important. The void might be the space where your real life is supposed to be. This is why Dostoevsky is such a crucial guide. He understood that the path through emptiness isn't around it, or over it, or under it. It's through it. His characters who find meaning don't do so by avoiding the fundamental questions of existence, but by facing them head-on. They don't escape the human condition. They embrace it fully, with all its difficulty and responsibility. But before we can understand their solutions, we need to understand the problem more deeply. We need to look at the different ways human beings try to cope with existential emptiness, and why those strategies ultimately fail. We need to understand why the underground man retreats into spiteful isolation, why Raskolnikov thinks he can transcend moral boundaries, why Ivan gets trapped in his own intellect. Because chances are you recognize yourself in one or more of these patterns. Chances are you've tried some of these strategies yourself. And chances are they've left you feeling more empty than before. Over the next 9 parts of this journey, we're going to take a deep dive into the psychology of emptiness through the lens of Dostoevsky's greatest characters. We're going to understand why you feel the way you do, why your current strategies aren't working, and most importantly, what you can do about it. But I want to warn you, this isn't going to be comfortable. Dostoevsky doesn't offer easy answers or quick fixes. What he offers is something far more valuable: the possibility of an authentic life. A life where the emptiness transforms from a void to be filled into a space of genuine freedom. A life where you stop running from the fundamental questions of existence and start living the answers. The question we're exploring together is simple to state, but complex to answer. Why do you feel empty, and what can you do about it? By the end of our journey, you'll have a clear understanding not just of the problem, but of the path forward. You'll understand why you feel the way you do, and more importantly, what you can choose to do about it. Are you ready to stop running from the emptiness and start walking toward the truth? Are you prepared to confront the possibility that the void you're trying to fill might actually be the space where your authentic life begins? Then let's begin. Let's start with a character who embodies one of the most common responses to existential emptiness, the underground man, and his choice to retreat from life entirely rather than engage with its difficulties. Because understanding his darkness is a first step toward finding your own light. Part 2, the underground man's confession, exploring consciousness as burden. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. These are the opening words of one of the most unsettling characters in all of literature. The underground man from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground doesn't introduce himself with his name, his profession, or his achievements. He introduces himself with his pain. And in doing so, he speaks for everyone who has ever felt trapped inside their own mind. But why does he call himself sick? Why spiteful? And why should we care about this bitter, isolated man who seems to hate both himself and everyone around him? Because, uncomfortable as it may be to admit, the underground man is us when we're at our worst. He's what happens when consciousness becomes a curse rather than a gift. Let me paint you a picture of modern life that might feel familiar. You wake up in the morning, and before your feet hit the floor, your mind is already racing. You're analyzing the conversation you had yesterday, wondering if you said the wrong thing. You're rehearsing the meeting you have later, imagining all the ways it could go badly. You're comparing yourself to the person whose success story you saw on social media last night. You're thinking about thinking. By the time you've had your first cup of coffee, you've already lived through 17 different scenarios, criticized yourself for at least 5 different shortcomings, and felt both superior and inferior to various people you barely know. Sound familiar? Welcome to the underground man's world. The underground man represents something that Dostoevsky identified as uniquely modern: hyperconsciousness. He's not just aware. He's aware that he's aware, and he's aware of being aware. He's trapped in an infinite loop of self-reflection that leads nowhere except deeper into isolation and bitterness. Listen to how he describes his condition. I have more life in me than others, but I am unable to live that life. This is the central tragedy of hyperconsciousness. The more aware we become of life's possibilities, the more paralyzed we become by them. The more we understand about human nature, the more disgusted we become with our own humanity. The more we see through social conventions, the more isolated we become from society. The underground man has what we might call today an anxiety disorder. But Dostoevsky understood that this wasn't just a psychological problem. It was an existential one. The underground man's anxiety comes from his acute awareness of his own freedom and responsibility. He knows that every choice he makes reveals something about who he is, and he's terrified of what that revelation might be. Think about your last social interaction that left you feeling drained or anxious. Chances are you spent at least some time afterward analyzing it. Did you say the right thing? Did you come across as too eager or not interested enough? What did your tone of voice convey? What did your body language suggest? The underground man lives in this analytical purgatory all the time. But here's where it gets really interesting. The underground man's problem isn't that he lacks self-awareness. His problem is that he has too much of it. He's so busy analyzing himself that he never actually lives. He's like someone who's so focused on taking pictures of a sunset that they never actually see it. This is what Dostoevsky called the disease of consciousness. The underground man tells us, I swear to you that be overly conscious is a disease, a genuine, absolute disease. He's not being melodramatic here. He's identifying something profound about the human condition. Consciousness, our greatest gift, can become our greatest burden when it turns inward and becomes self-consuming. The underground man spends his days in what he calls his underground. Not literally a basement, but a psychological space of withdrawal from life. He works a meaningless government job that he despises, but he won't quit because quitting would require him to make a choice about what he actually wants. He interacts with people, but only to confirm his belief that human relationships are fundamentally based on power struggles and self-deception. Most tellingly, he sabotages every opportunity for genuine connection. When old schoolmates invite him to a farewell party, he crashes it uninvited and spends the evening making everyone uncomfortable with his bitter observations about their hypocrisy. When he encounters a young prostitute who might offer him a moment of human tenderness, he destroys the possibility by lecturing her about the degradation of her profession, then try and save her in a way that's really about making himself feel superior. Why does he do this? Because connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires accepting that he might be wrong about life, about himself, about others. The underground man would rather be right and alone than risk being wrong and connected. This is a trap of hyperconsciousness. It becomes a defense mechanism against living. If you're always analyzing, you never have to act. If you're always critiquing, you never have to create. If you're always finding fault, you never have to risk being found wanting yourself. The underground man has convinced himself that his isolation is a mark of his superiority. He's too intelligent for the simple pleasures that satisfy ordinary people. He's too perceptive to be fooled by social conventions. He's too sophisticated to believe in love, friendship, or meaningful work. But Dostoevsky shows us that this supposed superiority is actually a form of cowardice. The underground man's spitefulness isn't random cruelty. It's a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, in a life that his own consciousness has drained of meaning. He tells us, "I've been living like this for 40 years. I am 40 now. I used to be in the civil service, but am no longer. I was a spiteful civil servant." Notice that tense. Used to be, am no longer. He's describing a life of negations, of things he stopped doing rather than things he's chosen to do. This is what makes the underground man so relevant to our current moment. We live in an age of unprecedented self-awareness. We have access to more information about psychology, personality types, cognitive biases, and human behavior than any generation in history. We can analyze our childhood traumas, understand our attachment styles, identify our limiting beliefs, and diagnose our mental health conditions. But often, all this self-knowledge doesn't make us happier or more fulfilled. Instead, it can make us more self-conscious, more paralyzed by our own awareness of our limitations. We become curators of our own personality, rather than people actually living their lives. Social media has created a world of underground men and women. We scroll through feeds, analyzing and critiquing performances of others while carefully crafting our own. We become hyper-aware of how we're being perceived, what image we're projecting, how our posts are being received. We live in a constant state of meta-commentary about our own lives, rather than actually living them. The underground man would have been brilliant at social media. He would have crafted the perfect cynical tweet, the devastating Instagram story that subtly undermines everyone else's happiness while maintaining plausible deniability. He would have been a master of the humble brag and the expert at finding the intellectual flaw in every popular opinion. But what's the cost of this hyperconsciousness? The underground man gives us the answer. The most painful thing is to be unable to weep, and the most tormenting thing is to be unable to love. When we become too conscious of our own motivations, we start to doubt the authenticity of our emotions. Are we really sad, or are we performing sadness? Do we really love this person, or are we just seeking validation? Are we really angry about injustice, or are we just enjoying the feeling of moral superiority? The underground man has analyzed himself out of the ability to feel genuinely. He's like a person who's learned so much about how magic tricks work that they can no longer enjoy the magic. He knows too much about human psychology to trust his own psychology. This creates what we might call the authenticity paradox. The more we try to be authentic by analyzing our motivations and checking our feeling for genuineness, the less authentic we become. True authenticity requires a certain unself-conscious spontaneity that excessive self-awareness destroys. The underground man understands this paradox intellectually, but he can't escape it. He tells us, every decent man of our age must be a coward and a slave. That is his normal condition. Why? Because anyone with enough consciousness to see through social conventions will also have enough consciousness to see through their own motivations, which leads to paralysis. But here's what's both beautiful and tragic about Dostoevsky's portrayal. The underground man's very awareness of his condition is also his potential salvation. He knows he's trapped. He knows he's choosing spite over love, analysis over action, superiority over connection. He's not unconsciously destructive. He's consciously destructive, which means he can also be consciously constructive. The underground man represents the first stage in a journey from emptiness to authenticity, the recognition that consciousness itself can be a prison. His confession is brutal in its honesty. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. But this honesty is also the beginning of possibility. Most of us aren't as consciously destructive as the underground man, but we participate in smaller versions of his patterns. We overthink our relationships until we've analyzed all the spontaneity out of them. We become so aware of our privilege or our trauma or our personality type that we use this awareness as an excuse for not changing. We develop a sophisticated understanding of why we are the way we are, but we use that understanding to justify staying exactly as we are. The underground man's great insight is that consciousness without action is torture. Awareness without responsibility is hell. Understanding without courage to change is the deepest form of self-betrayal. So, what's the way out of the underground? The underground man doesn't give us the answer. He gives us the problem in its purest form. But by understanding his trap so clearly, we can begin to see the possibility of a different path. The way forward isn't less consciousness. It's consciousness with courage. It's self-awareness that leads to self-compassion rather than self-torture. It's analysis that leads to action rather than paralysis. It's the recognition that being perfectly conscious is less important than being imperfectly alive. The underground man's confession is ultimately a gift to us. By showing us hyperconsciousness taken to its logical extreme, he illuminates a trap that many of us fall into without realizing it. His darkness helps us recognize our own shadows, and recognition is always the first step toward transformation. In our next exploration, we'll meet another character who tried a very different approach to existential emptiness. Raskolnikov, who thought he could transcend the human condition through an act of will. Where the underground man retreated from life, Raskolnikov tried to conquer it. But as we'll see, his path led to an even deeper form of isolation and despair. Part 3. Raskolnikov's Extraordinary Delusion, the emptiness of playing God. If the underground man represents the paralysis of overthinking, then Rodion Raskolnikov represents its opposite extreme, the delusion that we can think our way above the human condition itself. Where the underground man retreated from life, Raskolnikov tried to conquer it. Where the underground man was paralyzed by consciousness, Raskolnikov was intoxicated by it. But both paths led to the same destination: isolation, emptiness, and spiritual death. Raskolnikov, whose very name comes from the Russian word raskol, meaning schism or split, is a young, brilliant former law student living in poverty in St. Petersburg. But his poverty is more than financial. It's existential. He's empty, purposeless, drifting through life without meaning or direction. Sound familiar? This is exactly the kind of emptiness we explored in our first conversation. But instead of sitting with this emptiness, instead of examining what it might be trying to tell him, Raskolnikov decides to fill it with something extraordinary. He develops what he calls his theory, a philosophical justification that divides humanity into two categories: the ordinary masses who must obey moral laws, and the extraordinary few who have the right to transgress those laws in service of a higher purpose. Napoleon could kill thousands to reshape Europe. Great reformers could break conventional morality to serve humanity's greater good. And Raskolnikov? Well, Raskolnikov believes he might just be one of these extraordinary individuals. This isn't just academic philosophy for him. This is personal salvation. If he can prove to himself that he belongs to the extraordinary category, then his life has meaning. If he can demonstrate that he's above ordinary moral constraints, then he's above ordinary human emptiness too. So he decides to test his theory in the most definitive way possible. He will commit murder. His victim is an old pawnbroker, a woman he considers worthless, even harmful to society. She's greedy. She exploits the poor. She contributes nothing positive to the world. In Raskolnikov's calculation, killing her serves multiple purposes. It eliminates a social parasite. It provides him with money to continue his education and help his family. And most importantly, it proves that he has the psychological strength to transcend ordinary morality. It's the perfect crime, he tells himself. Utilitarian, rational, even altruistic. He's not killing out of passion or greed. He's killing out of principle, out of a higher understanding of human value and social good. But here's what Raskolnikov discovers, and what every person who tries to solve existential emptiness through superiority eventually learns. The moment you separate yourself from common humanity, you cut yourself off from the very thing that could actually fill the void: genuine human connection. The crime itself is messy, imperfect, traumatic. Nothing goes according to plan. He ends up having to kill the pawnbroker's innocent half-sister, who arrives unexpectedly. He nearly gets caught multiple times. The money he steals, his supposed practical motive, he barely touches, hiding it under a stone like it's cursed. But the real horror isn't in the killing itself. It's in what happens afterward. Raskolnikov discovers that his extraordinary act hasn't made him extraordinary. Instead, it's made him utterly alone. He can't tell anyone what he's done. without facing consequences. He can't celebrate his supposed superiority without revealing his crime. He can't even enjoy the money without confronting the blood that stains it. Most devastatingly, he can't connect authentically with another human being while carrying the secret that defines him. The crime that was supposed to prove his transcendence instead becomes his prison. This is where Raskolnikov's story becomes urgently relevant to our modern condition. We may not be planning murders, but how many of us try to solve our existential emptiness by proving our superiority? How many of us try to fill the void by placing ourselves above others? Think about it. That person who becomes obsessed with accumulating wealth not for what money can buy, but for what wealth represents, superiority over those who have less. The intellectual who needs to be the smartest person in every room, who can't simply enjoy a conversation without demonstrating their superior knowledge. The social media influencer who curates a perfect life not for their own enjoyment, but to prove they're living better than their followers. Or consider more subtle forms. The person who becomes a vegetarian not primarily for health or environmental reasons, but for the moral superiority it provides over meat eaters. The political activist who cares more about being right than being effective, more about feeling superior to the other side than actually solving problems. The spiritual seeker who collects enlightenment experiences like trophies, more interested in transcending humanity than in serving it. These are all versions of Raskolnikov's delusion. The belief that we can escape the fundamental human condition by rising above it, by proving that we're not like everyone else. But here's what Dostoevsky understood and what Raskolnikov learns the hard way. The moment you separate yourself from common humanity in order to feel special, you lose access to the very thing that makes life meaningful, your connection to others. Raskolnikov's theory divides people into ordinary and extraordinary, but this division is itself the source of his emptiness. By placing himself above others, he cuts himself off from the possibility of genuine relationship with them. How can you truly love someone you consider inferior? How can you be vulnerable with someone you need to impress with your superiority? How can you find meaning in serving people you secretly despise? The tragedy of Raskolnikov's path is that it promises to fill the emptiness but actually deepens it. Every act of superiority creates more distance between you and others. Every moment spent proving you're extraordinary is a moment not spent in ordinary human connection. Every ounce of energy invested in transcending your humanity is energy not available for embracing it. This is what we might call the superiority trap. The belief that feeling special will make you feel fulfilled. But specialness by definition requires comparison. And comparison requires distance. And distance inevitably leads to isolation. Modern culture is particularly susceptible to this trap because we've been taught that self-esteem comes from being better than others rather than from being connected to others. We're encouraged to find what makes us unique, to stand out from the crowd, to be extraordinary. Social media amplifies this by providing constant opportunities to compare ourselves to others and present curated versions of our supposedly superior lives. But the paradox is that the more special you need to feel, the more empty you actually are. Genuine fulfillment doesn't require superiority. It requires authenticity, connection, and purpose. A person who is deeply engaged in meaningful relationships and meaningful work doesn't need to feel extraordinary because they feel alive. Raskolnikov's crime is the ultimate expression of what happens when someone tries to solve existential emptiness through superiority rather than through connection. He literally separates himself from the human community through an act that proves he's different from them. But this separation, which was supposed to be his liberation, becomes his torment. The psychological aftermath of the crime is devastating. Raskolnikov develops what we would today recognize as severe depression and anxiety. He can't eat, can't sleep, can't concentrate. He's suspicious of everyone and everything. He oscillates between grandiose thoughts about his superiority and crushing guilt about his actions. Most tellingly, he becomes unable to love or be loved. When his mother and sister arrive in St. Petersburg, their genuine care for him feels like torture because he can't reciprocate authentically while hiding his true self. When the young, idealistic Razumikin tries to befriend him, Raskolnikov pushes him away because he can't bear the weight of accepting kindness from someone he's deceiving. This is the deepest tragedy of the superiority trap. It doesn't just separate you from others. It separates you from yourself. Raskolnikov can't access his own capacity for love, compassion, or genuine feeling because he's too busy maintaining the fiction of his extraordinariness. The emptiness he was trying to fill with his extraordinary act becomes a chasm that swallows everything good in his life. He's like someone who burned down his house to prove he was fireproof. But Dostoevsky doesn't leave us in despair. The genius of crime and punishment is that it shows us both the problem and the solution. Raskolnikov's healing begins only when he stops trying to be extraordinary and starts accepting his ordinary humanity. This happens through his relationship with Sonia, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her family. Sonia represents everything Raskolnikov's theory despises. She's powerless, degraded, seemingly worthless by society's standards. But she's also the only person in the novel who possesses what Raskolnikov lacks: the ability to love without conditions, to maintain faith without certainty, to find meaning without superiority. When Raskolnikov finally confesses his crime to Sonia, something remarkable happens. She doesn't recoil in horror at his extraordinariness. She recognizes his ordinariness. She sees that beneath his grandiose theories and superior attitude is a scared, lonely young man who made a terrible mistake. And instead of confirming his specialness through shock or admiration, she offers him something far more valuable: ordinary human compassion. This is the beginning of Raskolnikov's resurrection, not through proving his extraordinariness, but through accepting his ordinariness, not through rising above humanity, but through rejoining it, not through superiority, but through humility. The path out of the superiority trap isn't to become ordinary in the sense of mediocre or unambitious. It's to recognize that your worth doesn't depend on being better than others, that your meaning doesn't come from your superiority, and that your emptiness can't be filled by elevating yourself above the human condition. Raskolnikov's story teaches us that the extraordinary life isn't one that transcends humanity. It's one that embraces humanity fully. The person who makes a real difference in the world isn't the one who stands above others, but the one who stands with others. The individual who finds genuine meaning isn't the one who needs to feel special, but the one who finds specialness in the ordinary miracle of human connection. In our next exploration, we'll meet Ivan Karamazov, who took yet another approach to existential emptiness, the attempt to solve it through pure intellect. Where Raskolnikov tried to transcend morality through action, Ivan tried to transcend meaning through reason. But as we'll discover, intellectual brilliance can become its own form of prison, and logic can lead to the deepest forms of spiritual despair. The journey continues, and each character we meet reveals another facet of the human struggle with emptiness, and another clue about the path toward authentic fulfillment. Part 4. Ivan Karamazov's intellectual prison. When logic becomes a cage. If God doesn't exist, everything is permitted. This single sentence, spoken by Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, has echoed through philosophy, literature, and human consciousness for over a century. It sounds like a declaration of freedom, doesn't it? A liberation from constraint, an intellectual breakthrough that opens up infinite possibilities for human action and meaning. But for Ivan himself, these words aren't a celebration. They're a death sentence. Ivan Karamazov represents perhaps the most modern of all Dostoevsky's characters, the brilliant intellectual who has thought himself into a corner from which there appears to be no escape. Where the underground man was paralyzed by self-consciousness and Raskolnikov was deluded by superiority, Ivan is imprisoned by his own logic. He's the older brother in the Karamazov family, a successful journalist and intellectual living in Moscow. At 24, he possesses one of the most formidable minds in literature, analytical, systematic, uncompromising in his pursuit of truth. But this very intellectual power, which should be his greatest asset, becomes his greatest source of suffering. Ivan's problem begins with his integrity. Unlike many intellectuals who can compartmentalize their beliefs, who can hold contradictory ideas without psychological distress, Ivan demands consistency. If he's going to believe something, he's going to believe it completely and follow it to its logical conclusion, no matter how uncomfortable that conclusion might be. And Ivan's logical analysis of existence has led him to a devastating conclusion. The universe is fundamentally meaningless, and human suffering is absurd and unjustifiable. This is an abstract philosophy for Ivan. It's deeply personal. He's constructed what he calls his case against God based on the reality of innocent suffering. particularly the suffering of children. In one of the most powerful passages in all of literature, Ivan presents his brother Alyosha with a catalog of real historical incidents of children being tortured, abused, and murdered. His logic is ironclad. If there is a God who is both all-powerful and all-good, then innocent suffering shouldn't exist. Since innocent suffering clearly does exist, then either God is not all-powerful, in which case, why call him God? Or he's not all-good, in which case, he doesn't deserve worship, or he doesn't exist at all. For Ivan, the evidence is overwhelming. The universe operates by natural laws, not moral ones. Suffering is distributed randomly, not according to justice. The innocent die while the guilty prosper. Children are born into circumstances that doom them to misery through no fault of their own. Therefore, Ivan concludes, there is no cosmic meaning, no ultimate justice, no divine plan. We are alone in an indifferent universe, and any meaning we find must be constructed by us, not discovered in the structure of reality itself. This is where Ivan's famous declaration comes from. If God doesn't exist, everything is permitted. Without a divine lawgiver, there are no absolute moral laws. Without ultimate meaning, there are no actions that are inherently right or wrong. Without cosmic justice, we are free to create our own values and live by our own rules. This sounds liberating. But Ivan discovers something that many modern intellectuals have discovered. Infinite freedom can feel exactly like infinite imprisonment. Think about your last trip to a streaming service with thousands of options. You spend 30 minutes scrolling through possibilities, and somehow the abundance of choice makes it harder to choose, not easier. Now multiply that by every moral decision, every life choice, every moment of meaning-making. When everything is permitted, how do you choose what to permit yourself? This is Ivan's torture. His brilliant mind has deconstructed every source of meaning, every moral framework, every reason for caring about anything. He's like someone who has taken apart a watch to understand how it works, and now holds a handful of gears with no idea how to make time meaningful again. But here's the cruelest twist. Ivan can't stop caring. His logical conclusion is that nothing matters, but his human heart continues to be outraged by injustice, continues to love his family, continues to suffer when confronted with meaningless pain. He's trapped between his head and his heart, between his intellectual conclusions and his emotional reality. This internal contradiction is literally driving him insane. Throughout the novel, Ivan experiences what we would today recognize as severe psychological distress, insomnia, paranoia, dissociation, and eventually hallucinations. His famous encounter with the devil isn't just a literary device. It's a psychological breakdown caused by the unsustainable tension between his intellectual nihilism and his emotional humanity. Ivan's condition perfectly captures what many people experience in our current cultural moment. We live in an age of unprecedented intellectual sophistication. We understand more about psychology, sociology, biology, and neuroscience than any generation in history. We can deconstruct gender roles, analyze power structures, trace the evolutionary origins of morality, and explain human behavior through brain chemistry. But often, all this knowledge doesn't make us happier or more fulfilled. Instead, it can make us feel like Ivan, intellectually convinced that nothing really matters while emotionally unable to stop acting as if everything does. Consider the modern experience of choosing a career. Previous generations might have followed family traditions, religious callings, or clear social expectations. But we've deconstructed all of that. We understand that career success is largely dependent on privilege and luck. We know that most jobs don't contribute meaningfully to human flourishing. We recognize that the economic system is fundamentally unjust. So what do we choose? If all careers are equally arbitrary, if success is largely meaningless, if economic systems are unjust, then on what basis do we make decisions? We're free to choose anything, but this freedom can feel paralyzing rather than liberating. Or consider relationships in the modern world. We've deconstructed traditional relationship models, analyzed the psychology of attachment, understood the social construction of love, recognized the power dynamics in romantic partnerships. We know that most relationships end, that happily ever after is a fiction, that love is largely neurochemistry. But we still want to love and be loved. We still form deep attachments. We still feel devastated when relationships end. We're intellectually convinced that romantic love is an illusion, while being emotionally unable to live without it. This is Ivan's prison. The gap between intellectual understanding and emotional reality, between what our minds tell us is true and what our hearts need be true. The tragedy is that Ivan's intellectual analysis isn't wrong. His critique of theodicy, the attempt to justify God in the face of evil, is devastating and largely unanswerable. His recognition of the apparent meaninglessness of the universe is shared by many serious thinkers. His conclusion that morality might be nothing more than human construction has significant philosophical support. But being right doesn't make him happy. Being correct doesn't fill the existential void. Having the most logically consistent worldview doesn't provide him with a reason to get up in the morning. This is what Dostoevsky understood about pure rationality. It can become a form of spiritual suicide. When you subject everything to logical analysis, you risk analyzing away the very things that make life worth living. When you demand rational justification for all your values, you might discover that the things you value most can't be rationally justified. Ivan's story reveals the limitations of what we might call philosophical materialism, the belief that intellectual understanding can solve existential problems. But some human needs can't be met through analysis. Some questions can't be answered through logic. Some forms of meaning can't be rationally justified. The modern world is full of people caught in Ivan's trap. They're too intelligent to believe in simple answers, but too human to live without meaning. They've seen through traditional sources of purpose, but haven't found adequate replacements. They understand that life might be absurd, but can't bear to live as if it is. This creates what we might call nihilistic depression. Not the sadness that comes from loss or trauma, but the emptiness that comes from the intellectual conviction that nothing ultimately matters, combined with the emotional impossibility of living that conviction. The person who stays awake at night, thinking about the heat death of the universe. The student who can't choose a major because they've analyzed the meaninglessness of all possible careers. The parent who loves her children desperately while being intellectually convinced that human life is an evolutionary accident in an indifferent cosmos. These are all versions of Ivan's condition, the prison of pure rationality. But here's what's important to understand about Ivan's story. His intellectual brilliance isn't the problem. His logical analysis isn't flawed. His philosophical conclusions aren't necessarily wrong. The problem is that he's trying to live on logic alone, trying to derive meaning purely from rational analysis. Ivan represents what happens when we make the mistake of thinking that intellectual understanding is the same thing as wisdom. Intelligence can show us what is, but wisdom shows us how to live with what is. Logic can deconstruct meaning, but it can't construct a life worth living. The way out of Ivan's prison isn't to become less intelligent or to abandon rational thinking. It's to recognize the limitations of pure rationality and to acknowledge that some aspect of human existence, love, beauty, meaning, purpose, might require something more than logical justification. Ivan's breakdown occurs because he's demanding that his heart accept what his head has concluded. But what if the heart has its own form of intelligence? What if emotional reality is as valid as logical reality? What if the fact that we can't help caring about things is itself meaningful, even if we can't rationally justify that meaning? In the novel, Ivan's potential healing comes through his relationship with his youngest brother, Alyosha, who represents a different approach to existence entirely. Where Ivan tries to think his way to truth, Alyosha tries to love his way there. Where Ivan demands rational justification for everything, Alyosha accepts mystery. Where Ivan is paralyzed by infinite possibility, Alyosha chooses to act with compassion regardless of ultimate meaning. This doesn't mean abandoning intelligence or embracing irrationality. It means recognizing that human beings are more than just thinking machines, that we have capacities for meaning-making that go beyond pure logic, and that sometimes the most rational thing to do is to acknowledge the limitations of rationality itself. Ivan's story teaches us that the goal of intellectual life shouldn't be to solve the mystery of existence, but to learn how to live beautifully within that mystery. The point isn't to find rational justification for everything we care about, but to care about things despite the lack of rational justification. In our next exploration, we'll meet the Grand Inquisitor, Ivan's own creation, who represents yet another response to meaninglessness, the attempt to escape the burden of freedom by surrendering it to authority. If Ivan represents a paralysis of infinite choice, the Grand Inquisitor represents the false comfort of having choices made for us. The journey through emptiness continues, and each character reveals another facet of the human struggle with meaning, and another clue about what authentic existence might look like. Part 5. The Grand Inquisitor's False Comfort. Escaping freedom through control. In the heart of the Brothers Karamazov, Ivan tells his brother Alyosha's story that has become one of the most famous passages in all of literature. The Grand Inquisitor. It's a story within a story, a philosophical parable that cuts to the very core of human nature and our relationship with freedom. Picture this. Christ has returned to earth during the Spanish Inquisition in Seville. He appears quietly without fanfare, but people recognize him immediately. He heals the sick, raises a child from the dead, and radiates the same divine love that marked his first appearance on earth. But instead of being welcomed by the church that claims to serve him, he is arrested by the Inquisition. That night, in his prison cell, Christ receives a visitor, the Grand Inquisitor, a 90-year-old cardinal who has spent his entire life in service to the church. What follows is one of the most penetrating critiques of human nature ever written. The Grand Inquisitor doesn't deny that this is truly Christ. Instead, he tells him that his return is unwelcome, even catastrophic. Why? Because Christ's original message, his offer of spiritual freedom through personal choice and faith, was a terrible mistake that has caused nothing but suffering for humanity. You wanted man's free love. The Inquisitor tells Christ that he should follow you freely, enticed and taken captive by you. In place of the rigid ancient law, man must hereafter with free heart decide for himself what is good and what is evil, having only your image before him as his guide. And this, according to the Grand Inquisitor, was humanity's greatest burden, not its greatest gift. The Inquisitor's argument is seductive in its logic and terrifying in its implications. He claims that Christ fundamentally misunderstood human nature. People don't want freedom, they want security. They don't want choice, they want certainty. They don't want responsibility. They want to be taken care of. The burden of deciding between good and evil, of choosing their own path, of taking responsibility for their lives, is too much for the vast majority of humanity to bear. Nothing, the Inquisitor declares, has ever been more insupportable for a man and a human society than freedom. So the Church, in its wisdom and compassion, has corrected Christ's mistake. It has taken the terrible burden of choice away from humanity and given people what they really want: bread, authority, and miracle, physical security, clear rules to follow, and spectacles that distract from the anxiety of existence. The Church feeds the people, tells them what to believe, give them rituals and ceremonies that make them feel special and connected. In return, people surrender their freedom to choose, their responsibility to think, their anxiety about meaning. It's a trade that the Grand Inquisitor presents as the ultimate act of love, the strong taking care of the weak by relieving them of the burden of being human. We have corrected your work, he tells Christ, and have founded it upon miracle, mystery, and authority. This might sound like ancient history, a critique of medieval Catholicism that has little relevance to our modern, secular world. But Dostoevsky wasn't just writing about the church. He was writing about a fundamental human tendency that manifests in every age and every culture. The Grand Inquisitor represents something that exists in all of us, the part that wants to escape the anxiety and responsibility of authentic existence by surrendering our freedom to some external authority that promises to take care of us. Look around our contemporary world, and you'll see Grand Inquisitors everywhere, offering us the same trade. Give us your freedom, and we'll give you security, certainty, and distraction from the fundamental questions of existence. Social media platforms are perhaps the most obvious modern equivalent. They offer us exactly what the Grand Inquisitor promised: bread, authority, and miracle. The bread is the endless stream of content that keeps us fed with stimulation and distraction. The authority is the algorithm that decides what we see, what we think about, how we spend our attention. The miracle is a dopamine hit of likes, shares, and comments that makes us feel connected and validated. In return, we surrender our freedom to choose how we spend our time, our authority to decide what's important, our responsibility to create our own meaning. We let the algorithm tell us what to care about. Let the platform decide who we interact with. Let the endless scroll replace genuine reflection and choice. The result is the same as what the Grand Inquisitor promised his flock. We feel taken care of, but we've lost our souls in the process. Consumer culture operates on the same principle. It promises that if we just buy the right products, live in the right neighborhoods, wear the right clothes, drive the right cars, we won't have to struggle with the difficult questions of who we are and what we value. The market will decide for us. Our purchases will express our identity. Our status will provide our meaning. Our possessions will fill our emptiness. All we have to do is surrender our freedom to choose what really matters and accept that what matters is what we can buy. Political ideologies often function as modern Grand Inquisitors too. They offer simple answers to complex questions, clear enemies to blame for our problems, and the comfort belonging to a righteous cause. Whether left or right, religious or secular, they promise that if we just follow the doctrine, vote for the right candidates, hate the right people, we won't have to struggle with nuance, ambiguity, or personal responsibility. The ideology will tell us what to think, how to feel, who to trust. All we have to do is surrender our freedom to think for ourselves and our responsibility to engage with complexity and contradiction. Even therapy culture can become a form of Grand Inquisitor thinking when it promises that if we just identify the right trauma, find the right diagnosis, follow the right treatment protocol, we'll be fixed. The therapeutic system will explain why we are the way we are, tell us what we need to heal, provide the framework for understanding ourselves. All we have to do is surrender our freedom to define ourselves and our responsibility to choose who we want to become. The pattern is always the same. Some authority, whether technological, commercial, political, or therapeutic, offers to relieve us of the burden of authentic existence. They promise bread, satisfaction of immediate needs. Authority, someone else to make hard choices. And miracle, experiences that make us feel special without requiring genuine growth. And the trade always seems reasonable at first. Why struggle with difficult choices when experts can choose for you? Why face uncertainty when ideology can provide certainty? Why deal with the anxiety of freedom when systems can provide security? But here's what the Grand Inquisitor doesn't tell his followers, and what modern Grand Inquisitors don't tell theirs. The relief they offer is temporary, but the cost is permanent. When you surrender your freedom to choose, you don't just lose autonomy, you lose the very capacity that makes life meaningful. Think about your most fulfilling experiences. Were they the moments when someone else made all the choices for you? When you were passively consuming what others created? When you were following scripts that others wrote? Or were they moments when you made difficult choices, created something meaningful, took responsibility for your own growth and development? The paradox of the Grand Inquisitor's offer is that it promises to solve the problem of human emptiness by eliminating the very thing that could actually fill that emptiness, the exercise of genuine choice in the service of authentic values. When we surrender our freedom to external authorities, we don't become fulfilled, we become hollow. We might feel temporarily satisfied, distracted, or secure, but the deep emptiness remains because we're not actually living our lives. We're living someone else's script for what our lives should be. This is why people can have everything the Grand Inquisitor promises: financial security, clear beliefs, constant entertainment, social validation, and still feel profoundly empty. They've traded their birthright of freedom for a mess of pottage. And the pottage never satisfies because it's not what the soul actually hungers for. The soul hungers for authenticity, for the experience of making genuine choices that reflect real values, for the responsibility of creating meaning rather than consuming it. But these things require exactly what the Grand Inquisitor wants to take away: the burden of freedom. Dostoevsky understood something that our culture often forgets. There's a difference between happiness and fulfillment, between comfort and meaning, between being taken care of and being alive. The Grand Inquisitor can provide the first thing in each pair, but only genuine freedom can provide the second. This is why the Grand Inquisitor's followers, despite having their immediate needs met and their anxieties temporarily quieted, remain fundamentally empty. They've been given bread, but not the bread of life. They've been given authority, but not authentic authority over their own existence. They've been given miracles, but not the miracle of becoming who they're truly meant to be. The tragedy is that many of us make the Grand Inquisitor's trade without even realizing it. We slowly surrender our freedom to choose in exchange for the promise of security and comfort. We let algorithms decide what we pay attention to, let consumer culture define what we value, let ideologies determine what we believe, let social expectations dictate how we live. Each surrender seems small and reasonable at the time. What's the harm in letting the platform decide what content we see? Why not buy products that express our identity instead of developing our identity through difficult choices? What's wrong with following political or spiritual leaders who seem to have all the answers? The harm is cumulative and often invisible until it's almost too late, like the frog in slowly boiling water. We don't notice that our capacity for genuine choice is being eroded until we realize we've forgotten how to choose at all. The Grand Inquisitor's most insidious lie is that freedom is a burden humanity is too weak to bear. He presents a surrender of freedom as an act of compassion, a recognition of human limitations. But Dostoevsky reveals this as a profound misunderstanding of human nature. Yes, freedom is difficult. Yes, choice involves anxiety. Yes, responsibility can feel overwhelming. But these difficulties aren't bugs in the human system. They're features. They're the very things that make us human, that give our lives meaning, that allow us to grow and develop and become who we're meant to be. When we eliminate the difficulty of choice, we don't make life better, we make it emptier. When we remove the anxiety of freedom, we don't create peace, we create spiritual death. When we surrender responsibility for our lives, we don't find security, we find meaninglessness. The Grand Inquisitor promises to solve the problem of human emptiness by eliminating the human condition itself. But the human condition, with all its difficulty, uncertainty, and responsibility, isn't the problem. It's the solution. At the end of Ivan's story, Christ doesn't argue with the Grand Inquisitor. He doesn't debate his philosophy or refute his arguments. Instead, he simply kisses the old man on his bloodless lips. This kiss represents everything the Grand Inquisitor has tried to eliminate: free love, authentic choice, genuine compassion that asks nothing in return. The kiss burns in the Inquisitor's heart, but he cannot accept it. He opens a prison door and tells Christ to leave and never return. He chooses the security of his system over the uncertainty of genuine love. He prefers the emptiness of control to the fullness of freedom, but the kiss remains. The possibility of authentic choice, genuine love, and real freedom remains available, even to those who have spent their lives running from it. This is Dostoevsky's ultimate message about the Grand Inquisitor and all the Grand Inquisitors who follow him. Their offer is seductive but ultimately false. They promise to fill our emptiness by taking away our freedom, but emptiness can only be filled by the exercise of genuine choice in the service of authentic love. The path out of emptiness doesn't lead to the surrender of freedom. It leads through the embrace of freedom, with all its difficulty and responsibility. It means choosing to live authentically even when authorities offer to choose for us. It means accepting the anxiety of genuine existence rather than the false comfort of being taken care of. The Grand Inquisitor's false comfort will always be available to those who want to escape the burden of being human. But for those brave enough to embrace that burden, something far more precious awaits: the possibility of a life that is genuinely their own. In our next exploration, we'll examine what Dostoevsky saw as a fundamental reality underlying all these escape attempts: the weight of radical freedom. We'll discover why the emptiness we've been exploring might not be a problem to be solved, but a space to be inhabited. The space where authentic existence begins. Part 6, The Weight of Radical Freedom. Dostoevsky's terrifying truth. We've journeyed through the darkness with some of literature's most tormented souls. We've seen the underground man trapped by his own consciousness, Raskolnikov deluded by a sense of superiority, Ivan imprisoned by his logic, and the Grand Inquisitor offering false comfort through control. Each character represents a different attempt to escape or solve the fundamental problem of human existence: the weight of radical freedom. But here's what Dostoevsky understood that we often don't. The emptiness you feel isn't a problem to be solved. It's the starting point of authentic existence. It's the space where your freedom lives. This is perhaps the most challenging insight in all of Dostoevsky's work, and it's the one that our culture is least prepared to accept. We're trained to see emptiness as pathology, freedom as license, and responsibility as burden. But what if we got it backwards? What if the very things we're trying to escape are actually the doorway to the life we're seeking? Let's start with a question that cuts to the heart of everything. Who are you? Not what you do for work, not what roles you play, not what others think of you, not even what you think of yourself. Who are you really at the deepest level of your being? If you sit with this question honestly, you'll likely encounter something unsettling, a kind of emptiness, a space that can't be filled by any external identity or internal narrative. This isn't the emptiness of depression or the void of meaninglessness we've been discussing. This is what we might call ontological emptiness, the fundamental openness of human existence. Dostoevsky recognizes emptiness as a signature of human freedom. Unlike a tree, which is bound by its nature to grow toward light, or a wolf, which is constrained by its instinct to hunt, human beings exist in a space of radical possibility. We are not predetermined by our genetics, our upbringing, our circumstances, or even our past choices. At every moment, we face the terrifying and exhilarating reality that we can choose who to become. This is what existentialists would later call radical freedom. The idea that human existence precedes essence, that we exist first and define ourselves through our choices. But Dostoevsky understood this concept decades before it became fashionable in philosophy departments. He saw it lived out in the daily struggles of his characters, each wrestling with the weight of their own freedom. Consider this carefully. If you were completely determined by forces outside your control, by your brain chemistry, your childhood experiences, your social conditioning, would you feel empty? Would you experience the anxiety of choice? Would you struggle with questions of meaning and purpose? Probably not. A rock doesn't feel empty. A computer doesn't experience existential anxiety. A person who is truly determined by external forces wouldn't struggle with these questions because they wouldn't really be choosing anything. The struggle itself is evidence of your freedom. The emptiness you feel isn't a malfunction. It's a space of possibility. It's the existential clearing where authentic choice becomes possible. It's what remains when you strip away all the identities, roles, expectations, and stories that others have imposed on you, or that you impose on yourself. But this freedom comes with a price that most of us are reluctant to pay: total responsibility for who we become. When Dostoevsky's characters confront their radical freedom, they often recoil in horror. The underground man retreats into spiteful isolation rather than face the responsibility of choosing how to live. Raskolnikov tries to escape into superiority rather than accept responsibility for being ordinary. Ivan attempts to think his way out of choice rather than make authentic commitments. The Grand Inquisitor offers to take responsibility away from others rather than help them bear it. Each of these responses is understandable because the weight of radical freedom is genuinely terrifying. If you are truly free to choose who you become, then you are responsible for who you are, not your parents, not your society, not your circumstances, not your past. This moment, this choice, this is where your life is created. Most of us spend enormous energy avoiding this recognition. We blame our parents for our problems, our society for our limitations, our circumstances for our choices. We point to our trauma, our mental health conditions, our lack of resources, our bad luck. And yes, all of these things are real and have real effects. But they don't eliminate the fundamental reality that within whatever constraints exist, you still have the freedom and responsibility to choose your response. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, captured this beautifully. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Even in the concentration camps, even under the most extreme conditions imaginable, the fundamental human freedom remained. The freedom to choose one's response to circumstances that cannot be changed. This doesn't mean that circumstances don't matter, or that everyone has equal opportunities. It means that within whatever reality you face, you retain the awesome and terrifying responsibility of choosing who you will be in response to that reality. But here's where most people get stuck. They want the freedom without the responsibility. They want to be able to choose their path without having to own the consequences of their choices. They want to be authentic without having to confront the emptiness that authenticity requires. The characters we've explored represent different attempts to escape this responsibility. The underground man says, "I can't help being spiteful. It's just who I am." Raskolnikov says, "I'm extraordinary. Normal rules don't apply to me. Ivan says, "Nothing matters anyway, so my choices don't really count." The Grand Inquisitor says, "People can't handle real choice. They need someone else to decide for them." Each of these is a form of what Sartre would later call bad faith, the denial of one's own freedom and responsibility. But Dostoevsky shows us that bad faith doesn't eliminate freedom. It just makes us miserable while we exercise it. The underground man chooses to be spiteful. Raskolnikov chooses to commit murder. Ivan chooses intellectual paralysis. The Grand Inquisitor chooses to control others. They're all making choices constantly, but they're lying to themselves about the fact that they're choosing. This self-deception is what keeps them empty and miserable. As long as you're denying your freedom, you can't exercise authentically. As long as you're avoiding responsibility, you can't experience the satisfaction that comes from genuine choice. As long as you're pretending that your life is happening to you rather than being created by you, you'll feel empty because you're not actually living. But what does it mean to live authentically? What does it look like to embrace rather than escape your radical freedom? First, it means accepting the emptiness as a feature, not a bug. The space of possibility that feels like emptiness is actually the most precious thing about human existence. It's what allows you to be genuinely creative, to make real choices, to become who you choose to be rather than who you're programmed to be. Think of it this way. If you were a filled container, there will be no room for new experiences, growth, or change. The emptiness is a space where your life can unfold. It's not a void to be filled from the outside. It's a creative space to be engaged from the inside. Second, it means taking full responsibility for your choices, even the unconscious ones. This doesn't mean being harsh with yourself or pretending that you haven't been influenced by factors outside your control. It means recognizing that even your unconscious patterns are ultimately choices that you can become conscious of and change. When you catch yourself in a habitual reaction, instead of saying, "I can't help it," you can say, "I chose this, and I can choose differently." When you find yourself repeating old patterns, instead of saying, "This is just how I am," you can say, "This is how I've been choosing to be, and I can make a different choice." Third, it means embracing the anxiety of choice rather than trying to eliminate it. The anxiety you feel when facing important decisions isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something is right. It's evidence that you're facing a real choice with real consequences, that you're taking responsibility for your life rather than letting it happen to you. This anxiety is what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that comes from looking into the abyss of possibility and realizing that you have to choose without any guarantee that you'll choose correctly. But here's the paradox. The more you try to eliminate this anxiety by avoiding choice, the more anxious and empty you become. The more you embrace the anxiety as the price of freedom, the more alive and authentic you feel. Fourth, it means accepting that you will make mistakes, that you will sometimes choose poorly, that you will have to live with the consequences of your choices. This isn't a bug in the system of human freedom. It's a feature. The possibility of making mistakes is what makes genuine choice possible. If you could only choose correctly, you wouldn't really be choosing at all. The fear of making mistakes keeps many people trapped in inauthenticity. They'd rather make no real choices and risk making wrong choices. But Dostoevsky shows us that the only real mistake is the refusal to choose authentically. Finally, it means recognizing that your freedom is not just about you. You are free, but so is everyone else. Your choices affect other people, and their choices affect you. The weight of radical freedom includes the responsibility to consider the impact of your choices on the broader human community. This is where Dostoevsky's vision becomes truly profound. He understood that radical freedom doesn't lead to radical individualism. It leads to radical responsibility, not just for yourself, but for the world you're helping to create through your choices. The emptiness you feel isn't a sign that life is meaningless. It's a sign that meaning isn't given to you from outside. It's created by you from inside. The anxiety you experience isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're doing something right, taking responsibility for your own existence. The loneliness you sometimes feel isn't proof that you're disconnected from others. It's recognition that genuine connection requires choosing to love rather than being compelled to love, choosing to commit rather than being forced to commit, choosing to care rather than being programmed to care. This is Dostoevsky's terrifying and liberating truth. You are radically free, completely responsible, and utterly alone, except when you choose not to be. The emptiness is not your enemy. It's the space where your authentic life begins. But recognizing this truth is just the beginning. The question remains, how do you live it? How do you move from understanding your radical freedom to exercising authentically? How do you transform the weight of responsibility from a burden into a source of meaning and purpose? This is where we turn from diagnosis to prescription, from understanding the problem to discovering the solution. In our next exploration, we'll meet Alyosha Karamazov, who represents Dostoevsky's vision of how to live authentically within the space of radical freedom. Unlike his tormented brothers, Alyosha has found a way to embrace both freedom and responsibility without falling into despair. The journey toward authentic existence begins with accepting the emptiness, but it doesn't end there. It continues with learning how to live beautifully within that emptiness, how to create meaning without denying freedom, how to choose love without escaping choice. The space of possibility is opening before us. The question is, what will you choose to create there? Part 7. Alyosha's Path, Love as Response. Choosing connection over isolation. After traveling through the darkness with the underground man's bitterness, Raskolnikov's delusions, Ivan's intellectual prison, and the Grand Inquisitor's false comfort, we finally meet someone who has found a different way, Alexei Karamazov, known as Alyosha. At 20, Alyosha is the youngest of the three Karamazov brothers, and in many ways, he should be the most tormented of all. He shares the same dissolute father, the same traumatic childhood, the same exposure to suffering and injustice that shaped his brothers. He faces the same existential questions, the same weight of radical freedom, the same confrontation with life's apparent meaninglessness. But unlike his brothers, Alyosha hasn't been crushed by these realities. Instead, he's found something that transforms the weight of existence from a burden into a calling. He's discovered what Dostoevsky believed was the only authentic response to the human condition: active love. Notice that word, active. This isn't the sentimental love that feels good but demands nothing. This isn't the romantic love that seeks to possess or be possessed. This isn't even a familial love that flows from biological bonds. This is love as a choice, love as action, love as response to the radical freedom and responsibility we explored in our last conversation. Alyosha begins a novel as a novice in a monastery, studying under the elder Zosima, a wise and compassionate monk who represents everything that's authentic in religious life. But Dostoevsky doesn't keep Alyosha safely cloistered away from the world's problems. Instead, he sends him directly into the messiness of human existence, into his family's conflicts, into the pain of others, into situations where easy answers don't exist. And this is crucial to understanding Alyosha's path. His love isn't theoretical or abstract. It's not born from isolation or meditation or philosophical speculation. It's forged in the fire of actual human contact, tested against real suffering, proved through concrete action. When we first encounter Alyosha in his family gathering, we see something remarkable. While Ivan intellectualizes about suffering and Dmitri, the eldest brother, dramatizes his own pain, Alyosha simply pays attention to what people actually need. He doesn't try to solve everyone's problems or offer brilliant insights. He listens. He cares. He shows up. This might sound simple, but it's actually revolutionary. In a family where everyone is performing their pain, competing for attention, or trying to prove their superiority, Alyosha alone is present to the reality of others. He's not using their suffering as material for his own philosophical theories or as evidence for his own victimhood. He's responding to their need with whatever capacity he has. But Alyosha's love isn't naive or passive. He doesn't simply accept whatever people tell him or enable their destructive behaviors. When his father acts disgracefully, Alyosha doesn't pretend it's acceptable. When Ivan tortures himself with intellectual puzzles that lead nowhere, Alyosha doesn't pretend the puzzles are worth solving. When Dmitri wallows in self-pity, Alyosha doesn't join the wallowing. Instead, he offers something more valuable than agreement or sympathy. He offers authentic presence. He sees people as they really are, not as they present themselves, not as they wish to be seen, but as they actually are in their full humanity. and he chooses to love them anyway. This is what Dostoevsky meant by active love. Love that acts on real knowledge of the beloved. Love that chooses to care despite full awareness of the other's flaws and limitations. Love that commits to the welfare of another without requiring anything in return. Consider how different this is from the approaches we've seen from other characters. The underground man loves his own suffering more than he loves any person. Raskolnikov loves his idea of himself as extraordinary more than he loves any human being. Ivan loves his intellectual constructions more than he loves the world he's trying to understand. Each of them is ultimately self-absorbed, using others as objects in their own internal drama. Alyosha alone consistently sees others as subjects in their own right, as beings whose welfare matters independently of what they can provide for him. This isn't because he's naturally more compassionate or because he's had easier life experiences. It's because he's made a fundamental choice about how to respond to the human condition. Where others have chosen isolation, superiority, or control as responses to the weight of existence, Alyosha has chosen connection. But this choice isn't made once and then finished. It's renewed in every encounter, tested in every relationship, proved through daily actions. Watch how Alyosha responds to the crisis that occurs when his beloved elder Zosima dies and his body begins to decompose quickly, a sign, according to superstitious believers, that he wasn't truly holy. The other monks are scandalized. Visitors lose faith. Even Alyosha is shaken, experiencing what might be called a crisis of meaning. But notice what Alyosha doesn't do. He doesn't retreat into cynical isolation like the underground man. He doesn't try to prove his superiority over those who are losing faith. He doesn't construct elaborate intellectual theories to explain away the difficulty. He doesn't surrender his freedom to some external authority that promises easy answers. Instead, he goes out into the world and chooses to love more actively, not less. He spends time with children, teaching them about compassion and forgiveness. He helps resolve family conflicts. He visits people who are suffering. The crisis doesn't turn him inward, it turns him outward. This reveals something profound about the nature of authentic response to existential challenges. When life presents us with evidence that our beliefs might be wrong, that our hopes might be naive, that our efforts might be meaningless, we have a choice. We can retreat into protective strategies that shield us from further disappointment, or we can lean deeper into the practices that connect us to life itself. Alyosha chooses connection over protection, love over safety, engagement over withdrawal. And in making this choice repeatedly, he discovers something that his brothers miss. Love that acts doesn't require certainty about ultimate meaning. It doesn't need philosophical justification or religious guarantee. It doesn't depend on perfect knowledge or guaranteed outcomes. Active love is its own justification. When you're genuinely caring for another person's welfare, when you're truly present to their reality, when you're acting from authentic concern rather than hidden agenda, you're not empty. You're not isolated. You're not searching for meaning because you're creating it. This is a secret that Alyosha has discovered and that his brothers cannot grasp. The existential void isn't filled by getting something from outside yourself. It's filled by giving something of yourself to others. The emptiness isn't solved by finding the right belief system or achieving the right status or gaining the right knowledge. It's transformed by choosing to care about something beyond yourself. But this transformation isn't automatic or easy. Active love requires everything that Alyosha's brothers are trying to avoid: vulnerability, uncertainty, the risk of being hurt, the possibility of being wrong, the acceptance of responsibility without guarantee of reward. When you choose to love actively, you choose to care about outcomes you can't control. You invest in relationships that might fail. You commit to the welfare of people who might not reciprocate. You act on values that might not be objectively true. You exercise your radical freedom in service of something larger than your own comfort or certainty. This is why active love is the ultimate expression of authentic existence. It requires you to embrace your freedom fully, to choose without coercion, to act without guarantee, to commit without certainty. But instead of using this freedom for self-aggrandizement or self-protection, you use it for self-giving. The result is paradoxical. By giving yourself away, you become more yourself. By losing your life in service of others, you find a life that's truly yours. By emptying yourself through active love, you discover that the emptiness was never a void to be filled, but a space to be shared. Alyosha demonstrates this throughout the novel. He's constantly giving himself to others, mediating conflicts, comforting the suffering, teaching children, supporting his family, but he never seems depleted or empty. Instead, he seems more alive, more present, more genuinely himself than anyone else in story. This isn't because active love is a strategy for getting fulfillment. It's because active love is fulfillment. When you're genuinely focused on another person's welfare, you're not simultaneously focused on your own emptiness. When you're actively caring for someone else's need, you're not paralyzed by analysis of your own condition. When you're choosing to love regardless of circumstances, you're not waiting for circumstances to give your life meaning. But let's be clear about what this doesn't mean. Alyosha's path doesn't require becoming a monk or dedicating your life to formal religious service. It doesn't mean being nice to everyone or avoiding conflict or pretending that all choices are equally valid. It doesn't mean being passive or submissive or letting others take advantage of you. Active love is actually quite demanding. It requires you to see clearly, choose courageously, and act consistently. It demands that you develop a capacity to care about others' true welfare, not just what makes them happy in the moment. It requires you to sometimes say difficult things, make hard choices, and stand up for what matters even when it's inconvenient. What it means is making the fundamental choice that Alyosha makes, to use your radical freedom primarily in service of connection rather than isolation, love rather than superiority, care rather than control. It means recognizing that your existence is most authentic when it's most genuinely responsive to the needs of others. This choice is available to anyone, in any circumstances, at any moment. You don't need special training or perfect wisdom or ideal conditions. You need only the willingness to pay attention to someone else's reality and to act on what you discover there. The parent who chooses to really listen to their child instead of imposing their own agenda. The friend who offers presence instead of advice. The co-worker who cares about the quality of shared work instead of just their own advancement. The citizen who acts on concern for community, welfare, instead of just personal benefit. These are all expressions of Alyosha's path. Using your freedom to choose connection, using your awareness to serve others' genuine needs, using your capacity for love to respond to human condition rather than escape from it. The beautiful thing about this path is that it solves the existential problem not by answering the philosophical questions, but by making them irrelevant. When you're actively loving, you're not wondering whether life has meaning. You're creating meaning. When you're genuinely caring for others, you're not asking whether your existence matters. You're making it matter. In our next exploration, we'll meet another character who found a different expression of this same principle, Sonia Marmeladova, whose faith enabled her to love actively even in the most degrading circumstances. Where Alyosha shows us love in action through family and community, Sonia shows us love in action through faith and sacrifice. Part 8. Sonia's Radical Faith. Believing despite everything. In the darkest corners of crime and punishment, where human degradation seems complete and hope appears impossible, we meet Sonia Marmeladova, a young woman whose very existence challenges everything we think we know about faith, suffering, and the possibility of redemption. Sonia is 18 years old and works as a prostitute to support her consumptive stepmother, her alcoholic father, and their 3 young children. She lives in squalor, faces daily humiliation, and endures a form of existence that most people consider a living death. By any reasonable measure, she should be the most desperate, bitter, and hopeless character in Dostoevsky's universe. Instead, she becomes the novel's most powerful force for transformation and healing. What Sonia possesses, and what transforms not only her own unbearable circumstances, but also Raskolnikov's tormented soul, is something that our secular age has largely forgotten how to understand. Radical faith. Not faith as wishful thinking. Not faith as denial of reality. Not faith as escape from difficulty. But faith as the deepest possible engagement with existence itself. To understand Sonia's radical faith, we must first understand what it's not. It's not the faith of someone who has been protected from life's harsh realities. Sonia knows suffering intimately. She lives it daily. It's not the faith of someone who believes everything will work out well in this life. Sonia has no reason to expect her circumstances to improve, and they largely don't. It's not even the faith of someone who can explain or justify the existence of suffering. When Raskolnikov challenges her about how a loving God could permit the existence of such misery, she has no intellectual answer. She doesn't try to construct theodicies or philosophical systems that make sense of evil. Sonia's faith is something far more mysterious and powerful. It's a choice to trust in the ultimate meaning and value of existence despite having no rational grounds for such trust. It's a decision to act as if love is real, as if compassion matters, as if human beings have inherent worth, even when all evidence seems to point in the opposite direction. This is what makes her faith truly radical. It's not based on evidence, comfort, or favorable circumstances. It's maintained in the face of degradation, sustained through suffering, and exercised in conditions that would seem to make faith impossible. But here's what's crucial to understand. Sonia's faith doesn't make her passive or resigned to injustice. It doesn't lead her to accept her circumstances as God's will or to stop hoping for change. Instead, her faith empowers the most active love we see in any of Dostoevsky's characters. Sonia's response to her degrading circumstances is not self-pity, bitterness, or despair. It's sacrifice for others. She endures prostitution not for her own survival, but to keep her family alive. She faces daily humiliation not because she has no choice, but because she has made the choice to bear whatever is necessary for the welfare of those she loves. This is where Sonia's path intersects with Alyosha's, but goes even deeper. Where Alyosha practices active love in relatively supportive circumstances, he has his faith community, his elders' guidance, his family's respect. Sonia practices active love in circumstances of complete degradation and social isolation. Her faith enables her to see herself not primarily as a victim of circumstances or a product of social forces, but as a person capable of moral choice even within the most constraining conditions. She understands herself as someone who can choose how to respond to suffering, who can decide what to make of her pain, who can determine what her life will mean regardless of what has been done to her. This is the first transformative power of authentic faith. It locates the source of meaning and identity within the person rather than in external circumstances. Sonia's worth as a human being doesn't depend on her social status, her profession, or how others treat her. Her dignity comes from something deeper, from her capacity to choose love over hatred, sacrifice over selfishness, hope over despair. But Sonia's faith goes beyond personal resilience. It becomes a force that transforms others, most dramatically Raskolnikov himself. When he finally confesses his crime to her, something extraordinary happens. She doesn't recoil in horror at his extraordinary evil. She doesn't congratulate him on his extraordinary superiority. Instead, she sees through both his grandiosity and his self-hatred to human being underneath. "What have you done to yourself?" she whispers. Not, "What have you done to that old woman?" but "What have you done to yourself?" In that moment, she reveals an understanding that Raskolnikov has been running from, that his crime was ultimately an act of self-destruction, that in trying to prove his extraordinariness, he had actually diminished his humanity. But more importantly, she responds to his confession not with judgment or analysis, but with compassion. She doesn't try to understand his motives or explain his psychology. She simply recognizes his suffering and chooses to share it. This is the second transformative power of authentic faith. It enables genuine compassion for others, even others who have chosen evil. Sonia can love Raskolnikov not because she approves of what he's done, but because she sees that beneath his crime lies the same fundamental human condition that she faces: the struggle to find meaning and worth in a world that often seems to offer neither. Her faith allows her to separate the person from their actions, to hate the sin while loving the sinner, not as a theoretical principle but as a lived reality. She knows intimately what it means to be forced into actions that violate her deepest values. Her prostitution is as morally repugnant to her as Raskolnikov's murder is to him. But she has learned the difference between what you do and who you are, between your circumstances and your essence. When Raskolnikov asks her to read the story of Lazarus from the Bible, something profound occurs. As she reads about the dead man being called back to life, both she and Raskolnikov understand that they're not just reading ancient history. They're encountering a promise about the possibility of resurrection in their own lives. But notice what Dostoevsky is doing here. He's not suggesting that faith provides easy answers or magical solutions. Sonia's life doesn't suddenly become easy after this scene. Raskolnikov doesn't immediately transform into a saint. The promise of resurrection is just that, a promise, not a guarantee. Something to be lived into rather than something to be received passively. This is the third transformative power of authentic faith. It opens up the possibility of radical change without guaranteeing it. It suggests that no matter how far someone has fallen, no matter how completely they destroyed their life, no matter how hopeless their situation appears, the possibility of genuine renewal remains available. But this possibility must be chosen, worked for, lived into. Faith doesn't do the work of transformation for us. It gives us reason to believe the work is worth doing. Throughout the novel, Sonia embodies this understanding. She doesn't preach to Raskolnikov or try to convince him intellectually of anything. She simply lives her faith in his presence, demonstrates through her own existence that it's possible to maintain love, hope, and dignity even in the most degrading circumstances. Her faith is proven not through arguments, but through the quality of her presence, the authenticity of her care, and the transformative effect she has on others. She becomes living proof that the human spirit is capable of something that transcends circumstances, something that can't be destroyed by external conditions or explained to material analysis. This brings us to what might be the most challenging aspect of Sonia's path: her acceptance of suffering. Not passive resignation, not masochistic enjoyment, but something more complex and profound. The recognition that suffering, when born with love and faith, can become a source of growth, wisdom, and connection rather than simply an experience to be avoided at all costs. Modern culture has largely lost the ability to understand this concept. We tend to see suffering as purely negative, as something that diminishes human existence and should be eliminated whenever possible. But Sonia embodies an older and deeper wisdom, that suffering, while never good in itself, can be transformed into something meaningful through the way we choose to bear it. This doesn't mean seeking suffering or believing that it's divinely ordained. It means recognizing that when suffering is unavoidable, as it often is in human life, we retain the power to choose what it means, how we bear it, and what we make of it. Sonia's prostitution is clearly an evil, a violation of her dignity and worth as a human being. But the way she bears this evil, with love for her family, with maintained humanity, with continued faith, transforms even this degradation into something that reveals rather than destroys her essential dignity. This is perhaps the most radical insight in Dostoevsky's entire body of work, that the human capacity to choose our response to circumstances is so powerful that it can transform even the worst circumstances into occasions for the expression of our highest qualities. But this transformation doesn't happen automatically. It requires what Sonia possesses: authentic commitment to values that transcend circumstances. For Sonia, these values are rooted in her faith, but the principle applies regardless of the specific content of one's deepest beliefs. What matters is having something you believe in deeply enough that it can't be destroyed by external circumstances, something that gives you reason to maintain your humanity even when humanity seems pointless, something that connects you to a source of meaning larger than your individual experience. For Sonia, this something is her faith in God's love and in the ultimate meaning of existence. But the transformative power doesn't come from the specific content of belief. It comes from the authenticity and depth of the commitment. This is why Sonia can transform Raskolnikov, while his own intellectual brilliance cannot. His mind is more sophisticated than hers, his analysis of social conditions more accurate, his understanding of philosophy more developed. But her commitment is deeper. She has something she believes more than she believes in her own suffering, something she trusts more than she trusts her own experience, something that gives her access to resources for living that can't be destroyed by circumstances. In the epilogue of Crime and Punishment, we see Raskolnikov beginning his own journey toward this kind of authentic commitment. In Siberian prison, sustained by Sonia's continued presence and love, he slowly begins to understand what she has known all along, that the source of meaning lies not in our circumstances, but in our response to them, not in what happens to us, but in what we make of what happens to us. But his transformation doesn't come through intellectual insight or psychological analysis. It comes through learning to love, first Sonia, then the other prisoners, then life itself. He discovers that Sonia's faith was never about believing certain propositions or following certain rules. It was about choosing to live as if love is real, as if human beings have inherent worth, as if existence itself is fundamentally meaningful. This is what makes Sonia's faith truly radical. It's not based on what she can prove or explain, but on what she chooses to live by. It's not defended through arguments, but demonstrated through existence. It's not justified by evidence, but validated by its transformative power in her own life and in the lives of those who encounter her. In our secular age, we often dismiss this kind of faith as naive or primitive. We assume that intellectual sophistication necessarily leads away from faith and towards skepticism. But Sonia's example suggests something different, that there might be forms of knowledge that are accessible only through commitment, truths that can be discovered only by those willing to bet their lives on them. This doesn't mean abandoning reason or embracing superstition. It means recognizing that reason has limits, that there are questions that can't be answered through analysis alone, that some of the most important truths about human existence might require something more than intellectual assent. They might require the courage to live as if they're true. Sonia's radical faith offers a different response to the existential challenges we've been exploring throughout this journey. Where the underground man chose bitter isolation, where Raskolnikov chose grandiose superiority, where Ivan chose intellectual paralysis, where Grand Inquisitor chose controlling others, Sonia chose something that our culture barely recognizes as a choice. She chose to trust. Not trust that everything would work out well. Not trust that her suffering had a purpose she could understand, but trust that existence itself is meaningful, that love is real, that human beings have inherent worth, that the choice to care for others makes sense even when everything else seems senseless. This trust doesn't eliminate suffering or provide easy answers to difficult questions, but it provides something more valuable: the capacity to live authentically within uncertainty, to maintain humanity despite degradation, to choose love despite every reason for bitterness. In our next exploration, we'll turn to you, to the recognition of your own patterns, your own responses to existential emptiness, your own underground moments. We'll use the insights we've gained from Dostoevsky's characters to understand where you might be in your own journey and what choices are available to you. The question is no longer theoretical. Given what you now understand about the human condition, about freedom and responsibility, about love and faith, how will you choose to respond to your own existence? Part 9, your underground moment, recognizing your own emptiness. Now it's time to look in the mirror. We've journeyed through the darkness with Dostoevsky's most tormented souls, explored their attempts to escape or solve the fundamental problem of human existence, and discovered the paths that lead toward authentic living. But all of this exploration means nothing unless you're willing to ask the most difficult question of all. Which of these characters do you see staring back at you? This isn't an academic exercise or a personality quiz. This is a moment of radical honesty about how you've been responding to the weight of your own existence. Because here's the truth that Dostoevsky understood and that our culture often avoids. We all have an underground man inside us, a Raskolnikov, an Ivan, a Grand Inquisitor. We all have patterns of escape and avoidance that keep us from living authentically. The question isn't whether you have these patterns. You do. The question is whether you're willing to see them clearly enough to choose differently. So let's begin with the most uncomfortable recognition of all: your own underground moments. Those times when you retreat from life rather than engage with it, when you choose bitter isolation over vulnerable connection, when you use your intelligence as a weapon against others rather than a tool for understanding. Think about the last time you felt genuinely hurt by someone, not just annoyed or inconvenienced, but really wounded. Maybe a friend betrayed your trust, a partner dismissed your feelings, a colleague took credit for your work, a family member criticized you in a particularly cutting way. What was your first impulse? If you're honest, it probably wasn't to approach the person directly with your concerns or to examine what the situation might reveal about your own patterns. Your first impulse was probably something more like what the underground man would do: retreat into your inner fortress and begin constructing elaborate justifications for why the other person is wrong, stupid, or morally inferior. Maybe you spent hours or days replaying the interaction in your mind, crafting the perfect response you wish you had given, imagining scenarios where you demonstrate your superior understanding or moral high ground. Maybe you found yourself bringing up the person's past mistakes, cataloging their character flaws, building a case for why they're fundamentally flawed while you're fundamentally right. This is your underground man speaking, the part of you that would rather be right and alone than risk being wrong and connected, the part that uses intelligence as a shield against vulnerability, that prefers the safety of moral superiority to the danger of genuine relationship. But here's what the underground man never admits, and what you might not want to face. This retreat into spiteful analysis usually makes you feel worse, not better. The more time you spend in your underground, constructing elaborate justifications for your bitterness, the more isolated and empty you become. The underground man's great insight, and your underground's truth, is that consciousness can become a prison when it turns inward and becomes self-consuming. Every moment you spend analyzing why others are wrong is a moment you're not spending actually living your life. Now let's look at your Raskolnikov moments. Those times when you try to solve your existential emptiness through superiority. When you attempt to rise above the common human condition by proving that you're extraordinary. This might manifest in obvious ways. The need to be the smartest person in every room. The compulsion to one-up others' stories with your own more dramatic experiences. The tendency to judge others' choices while exempting yourself from the same standards. But it often shows up in subtler forms. Consider how you respond to others' success. When someone in your field gets recognition you think you deserve, when a friend achieves something you've been working toward, when a colleague receives praise you feel should have gone to you, do you celebrate their achievement genuinely? Do you use it as inspiration for your own growth? Or do you find yourself immediately analyzing why they don't really deserve it? Why their success is actually hollow? Why you would have done it better? This is your Raskolnikov speaking. The part of you that needs to feel special, that can't bear to be ordinary, that would rather diminish others and face your own ordinariness. The part that believes your worth depends on being better than someone else rather than on being authentically yourself. The tragedy of the superiority trap is that it keeps you perpetually empty. As long as your sense of worth depends on comparison with others, you're never safe, never secure, never actually fulfilled. There's always someone smarter, more successful, more talented, more whatever. The game is rigged against genuine satisfaction. But more fundamentally, when you're focused on proving your superiority, you're not focused on living your life. You're performing your life, curating it, managing it for effect. And performed life, no matter how impressive performance, doesn't fill the existential void, it deepens it. Now consider your Ivan Karamazov moments, those times when you use your intelligence to think yourself into paralysis, when you become so aware of complexity that you become unable to act authentically. This might show up in your relationship choices. You understand so much about psychology, attachment styles, relationship patterns, and human nature that you can analyze every potential partner into someone unsuitable. You can see the problems that might arise, the incompatibilities that might emerge, the ways things could go wrong. So you either don't commit at all, or you commit half-heartedly while maintaining intellectual distance. Or it might appear in your career decisions. You're aware of the problems with every profession, the ways each field contributes to social problems, the meaninglessness of most work under current economic systems. You can deconstruct every possible path until none seem worth pursuing authentically. This is your Ivan speaking. The part of you that demands rational justification for everything, that can't act without certainty, that has thought yourself into a corner where all choices seem equally arbitrary. The part that confuses intellectual understanding with wisdom, analysis with insight. The intellectual prison is particularly seductive because it feels sophisticated. It seems more advanced to see through everything than to commit to anything. But Ivan's tragedy, and perhaps yours, is that intelligence without the courage to act becomes a form of cowardice disguised as wisdom. You might have grand inquisitor moments too, times when you try to escape the burden of freedom by surrendering your choices to external authorities, or you try to control others to avoid facing your own responsibility. Maybe you surrender your autonomy to social media algorithms, letting them decide what you pay attention to, what you think about, how you spend your time. Maybe you follow political ideologies so rigidly that you don't have to think independently about complex issues. Maybe you let consumer culture define what you should want, romantic culture dictate how you should feel, therapy culture determine who you should be. Or maybe you play grand inquisitor to others, try to manage their choices, solve their problems, tell them how to live, because it's easier than facing the difficulty of your own existence. This is a most subtle trap, because it often feels helpful or necessary. But when you're either surrendering your freedom to external authorities or trying to manage others' freedom, you're avoiding the fundamental challenge of living authentically. taking full responsibility for your own choices while respecting others' responsibility for theirs. But here's the crucial recognition. These patterns aren't character flaws to be ashamed of. They're human responses to the genuine difficulty of existence. The underground man's analysis, Raskolnikov's ambition, Ivan's questioning, the Grand Inquisitor's desire for control, they all emerge from real struggles with real challenges. The problem isn't that you have these responses. The problem is when you become unconscious of them, when you let them run your life without choosing them, when you mistake them for the only possible responses to existential difficulty. Every moment you spend in underground analysis, every attempt to solve emptiness through superiority, every instance of intellectual paralysis, every surrender of freedom to external authority, these are choices. You might not be conscious of making them, but you're making them nonetheless. And if you're making them, you can make different ones. This is where your Alyosha and Sonia moments become crucial to recognize, because you have those too, even if they're rarer or less familiar. Those times when you chose connection over isolation, when you acted from genuine care rather than hidden agenda, when you committed to something despite uncertainty. Think about a time when you were genuinely helpful to someone without expecting anything in return. Not helpful in a way that made you feel superior or that served your own emotional needs, but helpful in a way that was purely about their welfare. Think about a moment when you chose to trust someone despite the risk, when you committed to something despite uncertainty, when you acted from love despite the possibility of being hurt. These moments might be small. Staying present with a friend who was grieving instead of offering quick solutions, choosing to be vulnerable in a conversation instead of maintaining your protective barriers, doing work that mattered to you despite the fact that it might not lead to conventional success. But in these moments, you were living authentically. You were using your freedom in service of connection rather than protection. You were filling the existential void not by getting something from outside yourself, but by giving something of yourself to others or to life itself. The recognition you need to reach is this. You have more choice in these patterns than you typically acknowledge. The underground man, Raskolnikov, Ivan, and the Grand Inquisitor all believe their responses are inevitable, that they have no other options given their circumstances and insights. But Dostoevsky shows us that this inevitability is an illusion. Alyosha faces the same existential challenges as Ivan, but chooses active love. Sonia experiences worse circumstances than any of the other characters, but chooses radical faith. Their responses aren't determined by their conditions. They're chosen despite their conditions. Your patterns of escape and avoidance feel inevitable because they become habitual. You practice them so often that they seem like natural responses rather than chosen strategies. But every habit was once a choice, and what was once chosen can be chosen differently. The question is, are you willing to choose differently? Are you prepared to catch yourself in the act of retreating to your underground, of grasping for superiority, of thinking yourself into paralysis, of surrendering your freedom to false authorities? More challengingly, are you willing to choose connection when isolation feels safer, to choose ordinariness when specialness feels more appealing, to choose committed action when uncertainty feels overwhelming, to choose responsibility when someone else's authority feels more comfortable? This isn't about perfect self-awareness or flawless choices. Alyosha has his moments of doubt and confusion. Sonia struggles with despair and uncertainty. The goal isn't to eliminate all patterns of escape and avoidance. It's to become conscious enough of them that you can choose your responses rather than being controlled by unconscious reactions. The emptiness you feel isn't your enemy. It's information. It's your psyche's way of telling you that you're not living authentically, that you're spending too much energy on strategies that don't actually work, that you're avoiding the very things that could fill the void. Your underground moments, your superiority attempts, your intellectual paralysis, your surrenders of freedom, they're all forms of avoidance disguised as solutions. They promise to solve the problem of existential emptiness, but they actually perpetuate it because they keep you from engaging authentically with life itself. The path forward isn't complicated, but it isn't easy. It requires the courage to face the mirror honestly, to see your patterns clearly, and to choose differently when the old patterns arise. It means catching yourself in the act of retreating and choosing to stay present instead. It means noticing when you're grasping for superiority and choosing to embrace your ordinariness instead. It means recognizing when you're thinking yourself into paralysis and choosing to act despite uncertainty. It means identifying when you're surrendering your freedom and choosing to reclaim your responsibility. But most fundamentally, it means recognizing that the emptiness you've been trying to escape is actually the space where your authentic life can begin. It's not a problem to be solved, but a space to be inhabited, consciously, courageously, and with full awareness of your freedom to choose how you inhabit it. In our final exploration, we'll discover what it means to have the courage to choose, to move beyond recognition of patterns into the active creation of an authentic life. The journey through the darkness has prepared you for this moment. The choice to stop running from your freedom and start living it fully. Part 10, The Courage to Choose. Your path to authentic existence. We've reached the end of our journey through the darkness with Dostoevsky's most profound characters. And if you've stayed with me this far, you've done something remarkable. You've looked directly into the abyss of human existence without turning away. You confronted the weight of radical freedom, recognized your own patterns of escape and avoidance, and discover that the emptiness you feel isn't a flaw to be fixed, but the very space where authentic living becomes possible. Now comes the most challenging part of all, choosing what to do with this knowledge. Dostoevsky's final message isn't comfortable, but it's profoundly liberating. You are radically free, completely responsible, and utterly alone, except when you choose not to be. The emptiness you feel is not the absence of meaning, but the space where your authentic life begins. This is both the most terrifying and the most beautiful truth about human existence. Terrifying because it means no one else can live your life for you. No external authority can tell you who to be. No perfect understanding can eliminate the anxiety of choice. Beautiful because it means your life is genuinely yours to create. Your choices actually matter, and your capacity for authentic existence is limited only by your courage to exercise it. But what does this mean practically? How do you move from understanding these insights to living them? How do you transform the weight of radical freedom from a burden into a source of meaning and purpose? The path forward rests on three foundational choices that Dostoevsky's characters either embrace or reject: accepting complete responsibility for your life, choosing authentic relationships over protective isolation, and committing yourself to something larger than your own comfort and security. Let's begin with the first and most fundamental choice: accepting complete responsibility for your life. This doesn't mean believing that you control everything that happens to you. You don't. It doesn't mean denying that circumstances, trauma, genetics, and social conditions affect your options. They do. It means recognizing that within whatever constraints exist, you retain the awesome responsibility of choosing your response to those constraints. Viktor Frankl discovered this truth in the concentration camps. Even when external freedom is completely eliminated, the fundamental human freedom remains. The freedom to choose your attitude, your values, your response to whatever reality you face. This freedom can't be taken away by others. It can only be surrendered by you. Complete responsibility means owning not just your obvious choices, but your unconscious patterns, your habitual reactions, your emotional responses, your characteristic ways of being in the world. It means recognizing that your depression, your anxiety, your loneliness, your emptiness, while they may have origins outside your control, are now your responsibility to understand and address. This isn't about blame or shame. The underground man, Raskolnikov, Ivan, and the Grand Inquisitor all torture themselves with blame while avoiding actual responsibility. Blame focuses on the past and what went wrong. Responsibility focuses on the present and what you can do now. When you truly accept responsibility, something extraordinary happens. You stop being a victim of your circumstances and become the author of your response to them. You stop waiting for life to provide meaning and start creating meaning through your choices. You stop looking outside yourself for the source of your problems and start looking within yourself for the source of your solutions. But this leads immediately to the second fundamental choice: choosing authentic relationships over protective isolation. The underground man's tragedy is that his insights into human nature, accurate as they often are, lead him to withdraw from human contact rather than engage with it more skillfully. He sees the games people play, the hidden motivations behind their actions, the ways they hurt and manipulate each other, and he concludes that genuine connection is impossible. But Alyosha sees the same human flaws and makes the opposite choice. He uses his understanding of human nature to love more wisely, not to love less completely. He recognizes that people are complicated, self-deceptive, and often hurtful, and he chooses to care about their welfare anyway. This is a choice that transforms everything, moving from self-protection to genuine care for others. Not the care that makes you feel good about yourself, not the care that puts you in a superior position, but the care that genuinely focuses on another person's well-being regardless of what you get in return. Authentic relationships require everything that the characters we studied try to avoid: vulnerability, uncertainty, the risk of being hurt, the possibility of being rejected, the responsibility of caring about outcomes you can't control. But they also provide the only thing that can truly fill the existential void: genuine connection with another consciousness. This doesn't mean becoming naive about human nature or pretending that everyone deserves your trust. It means developing the wisdom to love skillfully, to see people clearly while caring about them genuinely, to maintain appropriate boundaries while remaining open to connection, to protect yourself from genuine harm while not using protection as an excuse for isolation. The key insight is that isolation, while it protects you from being hurt by others, also protects you from being healed by others. When you wall yourself off from the possibility of pain, you also wall yourself off from the possibility of love, growth, and meaning. But authentic relationships can't be sustained without the third fundamental choice: committing yourself to something larger than your own comfort and security. This is what Sonia understands and what enables her to maintain love and faith despite circumstances that would crush most people. Her commitment to her family's welfare, her faith in ultimate meaning, her dedication to love despite everything. These commitments give her access to resources for living that can't be destroyed by external circumstances. Ivan's tragedy is that he demands rational justification for all his commitments, which leads to the inability to commit authentically to anything. He can't find logical proof that life has meaning, so he won't live as if it does. He can't rationally justify love, so he won't risk loving. He can't prove that morality is objective, so he won't act morally. But commitment doesn't require rational justification. It requires courage. The courage to bet your life on something that might not be rationally provable, but that calls forth the best in you. The courage to care about something more than your own immediate comfort. The courage to dedicate yourself to values that give your life direction and meaning. This might be commitment to family, to creative work, to social justice, to spiritual growth, to community service, to learning, to beauty. The specific content matters less than the authenticity and depth of the commitment. What matters is choosing to care about something enough that it can survive doubt, difficulty, and disappointment. But here's what's crucial to understand. These three choices, accepting responsibility, choosing authentic relationships, and committing to something larger than yourself, aren't made once and then finished. They're made over and over again, in small moments and large crises, in daily interactions and life-changing decisions. Every time you catch yourself retreating to your underground instead of staying present to difficulty, you have the opportunity to choose responsibility over avoidance. Every time you feel the impulse to protect yourself through superiority or isolation, you can choose vulnerable connection instead. Every time you're tempted to live only for your immediate comfort and security, you can choose to act on your deeper commitments. The path to authentic existence isn't about achieving some perfect state of enlightenment or solving all your psychological problems. It's about becoming conscious enough of your patterns that you can choose your responses rather than being controlled by unconscious reactions. This means developing what we might call existential courage, the courage to live fully within the human condition rather than trying to escape it, the courage to face uncertainty without demanding certainty, to act without guarantees, to love without insurance policies against being hurt. But let's be specific about what this looks like in practice, because philosophical insights without practical application remain just interesting ideas. First, practice radical honesty about your current patterns. Start paying attention to when you retreat to your underground, when you grasp for superiority, when you think yourself into paralysis, when you surrender your freedom to external authorities. Notice these patterns without judgment, but with clear recognition of what you're choosing. This might mean keeping a journal where you track your emotional patterns, your relationship dynamics, your decision-making processes, not for self-improvement in the shallow sense, but for self-awareness in the deepest sense, understanding how you actually operate rather than how you think you operate. Second, Begin making small choices that align with your deeper values rather than your immediate comfort. These don't have to be dramatic gestures. They can be as simple as staying present in a difficult conversation instead of shutting down, offering help when it's inconvenient, or choosing to create something meaningful instead of just consuming entertainment. The key is consistency over intensity. Better make small, authentic choices every day than to make dramatic gestures occasionally, and then return to unconscious living. Third, actively seek opportunities to be genuinely useful to others. This isn't about grand humanitarian gestures. It's about paying attention to the real needs of the people actually in your life and responding to those needs when you can. Listen more carefully to your friends. Help family members with practical problems. Contribute meaningfully to your work community. Volunteer for causes you genuinely care about. The goal isn't to become a saint. It's to discover that the emptiness you feel begins to transform when you're genuinely focused on others' welfare rather than obsessively focused on your own inner state. Fourth, commit to something that requires growth from you. This might be learning a skill that challenges you, taking on responsibilities that stretch your capacity, or dedicate yourself to work that matters more than your immediate self-interest. The commitment itself isn't as important as the fact that it's genuine and that it calls forth qualities in you that you want to develop. It should be something that you care about enough to persist with even when it becomes difficult. Something that connects you to purposes larger than your individual concerns. Fifth, develop a practice of what we might call conscious choosing. Throughout each day, pause periodically and ask yourself, what am I choosing right now? Am I choosing from fear or from love? Am I choosing to protect myself or to grow? Am I choosing to serve my ego or to serve something larger? This isn't about making perfect choices. It's about making conscious ones. Even choosing fear or protection or ego service becomes different when you acknowledge that you're choosing it rather than pretending it's happening to you. 6. Cultivate what Alyosha embodies and what Sonia demonstrates, the capacity to love difficult people. This doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior or putting yourself in dangerous situations. It means developing the ability to see the humanity in people who are struggling, to care about their welfare even when they're being difficult, to respond to their needs rather than just reacting to their behavior. Start with the people closest to you. Instead of trying to change them or judge them or fix them, simply try to understand what they actually need and offer what you can authentically provide. This practice alone will transform both your relationships and your inner life. 7th, embrace what Dostoevsky called active love in your daily life. This means love that acts on real knowledge of the beloved, love that chooses to care despite full awareness of difficulties, love that commits to others' welfare without requiring anything in return. Active love might mean staying present with someone who is suffering instead of offering quick solutions. It might mean doing necessary work that no one will notice or appreciate. It might mean sacrificing some of your immediate desires for the long-term good of people you care about. The beautiful paradox of active love is that it solves the problem of emptiness not by filling yourself up, but by emptying yourself out in service of others. When you're genuinely focused on someone else's welfare, you're not simultaneously focused on your own emptiness. But perhaps most importantly, learn to see your life as a creative project rather than a problem to be solved. You're not trying to achieve some perfect state of happiness or meaning. You're creating a life that expresses your deepest values and commitments through the choices you make moment by moment. This means taking responsibility not just for your actions, but for the quality of attention you bring to your existence. Are you living consciously or unconsciously? Are you responding to life or just reacting to it? Are you creating something meaningful or just consuming what others have created? Your life is not a test to pass or a puzzle to solve. It's a work of art to create. And like any art, it requires vision, commitment, practice, and the willingness to continue creating even when the work is difficult or when others don't understand what you're trying to make. The emptiness you feel isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that you're ready to begin creating consciously instead of living unconsciously. It's the raw material from which authentic existence can be crafted. But here's what Dostoevsky understood that our culture often forgets. This creation process is not primarily about you. The most authentic life is not the most self-actualized life. It's a life that serves something larger than self. The most fulfilled people are not those who have achieved all their personal goals. They're those who have found ways to contribute meaningfully to the welfare of others. This doesn't mean sacrificing your individuality or ignoring your own needs. It means recognizing that your individuality finds its fullest expression when it's offered in service of love, that your needs are most authentically met when you're meeting others' needs, that your freedom is most meaningfully exercised when it's used to enhance others' freedom. As we reach the end of this journey, you face the same choice that every one of Dostoevsky's characters faces. Will you continue living unconsciously, driven by patterns of escape and avoidance that promise relief but deliver emptiness? Or will you choose a more difficult but infinitely more rewarding path of conscious, committed, authentic existence? The choice is yours, and it's available to you right now, in this moment. Not tomorrow when you feel more ready. Not next week when your circumstances improve. Not someday when you figured everything out. Now, in whatever situation you're currently facing, with whatever resources you currently possess, within whatever constraints currently exist, you are radically free. You are completely responsible. You are utterly alone, except when you choose not to be. The emptiness you feel is not your enemy, but your invitation. The space where your authentic life can finally begin. The question is not whether you're capable of living authentically. You are. The question is whether you have the courage to choose it. Dostoevsky's characters who find their way out of the darkness all make the same fundamental choice. They choose to live as if love is real, as if human beings matter, as if their choices create meaning, despite having no rational proof that any of this is true. This is a leap of faith authentic existence requires. Not faith in any particular dogma or ideology, but faith in the fundamental worthwhileness of conscious, committed, loving engagement with life itself. The abyss of existence that once seemed so terrifying transforms into ground of infinite possibility. The weight of radical freedom that once felt crushing becomes a source of genuine liberation. The emptiness that once felt like a curse becomes a space where your most authentic life can finally unfold. You don't need permission to begin. You don't need perfect understanding or ideal circumstances. You need only the courage to choose, again and again, in small moments and large decisions, in private reflections and public actions, to live as if your life matters, as if your choices create meaning, as if love is the most reasonable response to the mystery of existence. The journey through the darkness is complete. The light you've been seeking was never outside you. It was a light you create through the quality of choices you make within the darkness. Your authentic life is waiting. The only question remaining is, will you choose it?